We now have a two-tier legal system, James, whereby white men will be treated harsher now under British law, James.
Well, yeah, it's really, really shocking, this. Basically now they have put in this system whereby pre-sentencing reports, which basically automatically take into account your race, your gender, your circumstance, all of that to mitigate the sentences that you might get for whatever crime you're alleged to have committed and been brought before the courts and convicted of. That now means essentially that white Britons are going to get the worst treatment when it comes to sentencing.
For generations, Britain has regarded itself as a defender of liberty and justice, principles woven into the very fabric of its national identity. But today, that self-image is being questioned. Across the political spectrum, figures like Vance have raised concerns that the United Kingdom is drifting from its core values. And he's not alone. A growing number of citizens share the unease that the nation is moving in a direction at odds with its traditions. At the center of the debate lies the justice system. New sentencing guidelines now ask judges to weigh factors, such as race, gender, and social background. Advocates argue this is a corrective measure, an attempt to reckon with historic inequalities. Critics, however, warn that this approach undermines a fundamental tenet of the rule of law, that justice must remain impartial, blind to personal identity. Vance has long been outspoken on such issues. He has previously criticized Britain's immigration policies, claiming that open borders threaten public safety. Now, with the recalibration of legal standards, the question being asked is whether the country is upholding its proud traditions or slowly abandoning them. This tension has become a defining feature of the political conversation in Britain.
Is the two-tier justice system. This is why they call Keir Starmer two-tier Keir. And I'll tell you something, guys, but the other point...
Even Keir Starmer recognises what a catastrophe this is.
Yeah.
Disappointed in this response, and the Lord Chancellor is obviously continuing to engage on this, and we're considering our response. And all options are on the table, but I am disappointed at this outcome, and now we'll have to consider what we do as a result.
Oh, I don't know, if only there was a Prime Minister who cared about the issue could do something. You're the Prime Minister, Keir. I mean, he's acting like he's just some dude off the street who's a little bit aggrieved.
Yes.
As the debate intensifies, attention now turns to Labour leader Keir Starmer and how his party positions itself within this controversy. The government's new sentencing framework has sparked significant division. Under these changes, pre-sentence reports are required to weigh factors such as race, gender, and social background before determining punishment. Proponents insist this is a necessary step to correct historic injustices and confront systemic discrimination. Yet the move has ignited deep concern about fairness. Critics argue that, while intended to balance the scales, it risks tilting them further, potentially granting leniency to certain minority groups while imposing harsher penalties on others, including white Britons, for identical offenses. This criticism strikes at the heart of a principle, long regarded as non-negotiable, that justice must remain blind. Instead of judgments based solely on actions, detractors warn that individuals are now being judged partly on identity. Figures such as American Senator Vance have gone further, cautioning that the reforms could create a two-tier justice system, one where the outcome of a case depends not only on what was done, but on who the defendant is. It is a shift that raises a troubling question for Britain: is the nation still committed to the principle of equal justice under the law? Or is that ideal beginning to erode?
It's ridiculous. But James, the reality is what they have literally done is brought in laws whereby if you are any of those identity politics groups, women, gays, of ethnic whatever origin, anything other than a white man must be treated more leniently. So by definition, white men will be treated harsher under the British legal system.
And we'll just be really frank about what we're talking about here. We're talking about, basically people of color, people of different religions getting a lighter sentence and a lighter treatment. And so this means, a lot of migrants who might commit crime, they're going to get a lighter treatment than somebody who is a Briton committing the same crime. That's shocking. Keir Starmer, I don't trust anything he has said there about claiming that he's distressed about that, because, this is the same guy who saw his opinion numbers absolutely plummet and then started talking about, oh, maybe we have to do something about immigration. Really, Keir? Really? Okay, fine. Now you tell us.
Keir Keir Starmer has recently insisted that free speech remains robust in the United Kingdom, yet that optimism is not universally shared. Across the Atlantic, U.S. Senator jdvance has pushed back forcefully, warning that Britain's approach to hate speech laws is steadily eroding one of democracy's most vital protections. Starmer presents a positive narrative that the nation balances liberty with responsibility. But Vance argues the reality is far more troubling. In his view, hate speech legislation is increasingly weaponized to stifle dissent and narrow the scope of public debate. The concern goes beyond shielding the public from genuinely harmful rhetoric. At issue is the growing ambiguity between what constitutes hateful expression and what is merely personal opinion. As that boundary blurs, Vance contends the state gains wider latitude to penalize citizens simply for voicing unpopular views. Critics, this trend is deeply unsettling. They accuse Starmer of either overlooking the problem or deliberately ignoring it for political convenience. And while the Labour leader avoids confrontation on the subject, his silence only reinforces suspicion. The debate cuts to the heart of Britain's democratic tradition. Free speech, once regarded as untouchable, is now increasingly seen as conditional. And that, for many, is cause for alarm.
The thing, too, the other week there was that phenomenal speech that J.D. Vance gave at the European Union where he called out Britain, and he called out Europe, but he called out Britain in particular and said that Britain, which was a bastion of liberty, has no longer become that, and they are straying very far away from that. And the real point is that if America is going to go and defend liberal democracies, and you want to be defended, you've got to act like a liberal democracy. And Britain has strayed so far from the centuries. It took centuries for Britain to develop the traditions of law and liberty that we enjoy as well. And now they're torching them at a rate of knots.
Under these rules, factors such as race and gender are now considered in determining punishment. In practice, that means an offender's background. The changes as a necessary correction to historic injustices. But critics warn the reality is far more troubling. The system risks undermining one of the justice system's most fundamental principles, equality before the law. Yet many now fear that ideal is slipping away. Instead of assessing actions, the state appears increasingly focused on who the offender is. Such a shift does not merely generate confusion, it deepens division. And more troubling still, it threatens to erode the very foundation of fairness, upon which Britain's legal system has long claimed to stand.
This undermines the most basic principle of our justice system. That justice is blind, that everyone's equal under the law, that you're not going to get preferential treatment based on who you are. And we already see it happening even before this formal recognition that it's happening. We have seen it over and over again with people getting ridiculously lenient sentences and then having people in the UK locked up for being in an anti-immigration protest, even if they weren't guilty of anything that was approaching violence, but they were at a violent protest, so they were guilty by association. Same thing doesn't happen with these pro-Palestinian.
Under Britain's new sentencing system, migrants and minority groups could, in some cases, receive more lenient punishments than others. The revised guidelines place weight on factors such as race and social background, an approach that, supporters argue, helps redress long-standing inequalities in the justice system. Yet not everyone sees it that way. Critics contend that the reforms tilt justice in the wrong direction, granting preferential treatment not on the basis of actions, but identity. The implications are significant. When citizens begin to believe that the law is no longer applied equally, frustration grows. Social cohesion weakens. Instead of uniting communities under a single standard of fairness, the system risks driving them further apart. At the heart of the debate is a principle as old as the rule of law itself. Justice must remain blind. For many, that principle now appears under threat. And if public trust continues to erode, the long-term consequence could be deeper resentment and division across British society.
Most concerningly, I look to our very dear friends, the United Kingdom, where the backslide away from conscience rights has placed the basic liberties of religious Britons in particular in the crosshairs. A little over 2 years ago, the British government charged Adam Smith Connor, a 51-year-old physiotherapist and an Army veteran, with the heinous crime of standing 50 meters from an abortion clinic and silently praying for 3 minutes. Not obstructing anyone, not interacting with anyone, just silently praying on his own. And after British law enforcement spotted him and demanded to know what he was praying for, Adam replied simply, it was on behalf of the unborn son he and his former girlfriend had aborted years before. Now, the officers were not moved. Adam was found guilty of breaking the government's new buffer zones law, which criminalizes silent prayer and other actions that could influence a person's decision within 200 meters of an abortion facility. He was sentenced to pay thousands of pounds in legal costs to the prosecution. Now, I wish I could say that this was a fluke, a one-off crazy example of a badly written law being enacted against a single person. But no, this last October, just a few months ago, the Scottish government began distributing letters to citizens whose houses lay within so-called safe access zones, warning them that even private prayer within their own homes may amount to breaking the law. Naturally, the government urged readers to report any fellow citizen suspected guilty of thought crime. In Britain and across Europe, free speech, I fear, is in retreat.
Keir Starmer's stance on immigration and border control has been marked by inconsistency. At times, he has leaned towards more open policies, only to retreat once public sentiment shifted in the opposite direction. That back and forth has fueled doubts about where he truly stands on one of the nation's most contentious issues. Among his most pointed critics is U.S. Senator J.D. Vance, who accuses the Labor leader of avoiding a clear position on border security. Vance argues that Starmer is attempting to please all sides without confronting the concerns of ordinary citizens, concerns over jobs, pressure on public services, and national security. Instead of directly addressing these anxieties, is portrayed as prioritizing political maneuvering, courting activists and interest groups, while distancing himself from the broader public mood. For many voters, this pattern of equivocation reinforces a perception of a leader disconnected from the realities people face in their daily lives.
For being in an anti-immigration protest, even if they weren't guilty of anything that was approaching violence, but they were at a violent protest, so they were guilty by association. Same thing doesn't happen with these pro-Palestinian protests. That's right. A very different approach. So we have seen it over and over again, and we're not immune from it. It's happening right here.
J.D. Vance has been unrestrained in his criticism of Britain's recent trajectory. At the heart of his concern is what he views as a retreat from the nation's long-standing commitment to liberal democratic values. Border security, in particular, has become a focal point. Vance argues that a nation's sovereignty and stability depend on strong borders, and he sees the UK's weakening approach as emblematic of deeper failings. For him, this is not simply a question of policy. It is a signal that Britain is losing grip on its identity and its control over the future. Once held up as a beacon of liberty and the rule of law, Britain, Vance contends, is drifting towards softer justice and political correctness at the expense of firm principle. A charge that resonates well beyond his own circle. Public frustration is rising within the UK itself, with immigration consistently ranking among the electorate's top concerns. For many, the call is clear: stronger borders, clearer leadership, and a return to decisive governance. Vance's warning has found an audience, one that believes Britain has strayed too far from the values that once defined it.
That there have been infringements on free speech that actually affect not just the British, of course what the British do in their own country is up to them, but also affect American technology companies and by extension American citizens. So that is something that we'll talk about today at lunch.
We've had free speech for a very, very long time in the United Kingdom, and it will last for a very, very long time. Well, no, I mean, certainly we wouldn't want to reach across US citizens, and we don't, and that's absolutely right. But in relation to free speech in the UK, I'm very proud of our history there.
For centuries, the principle that justice is blind has been central to the United Kingdom's legal tradition. The guarantee that every citizen, regardless of race, gender, or background, would be treated equally before the law. But that principle is now under strain. The rise of identity-based sentencing means personal factors from race to gender to life circumstances can influence whether an individual receives a harsher or more lenient punishment. The intent may be to address historic wrongs, but critics argue it introduces a new form of bias. Rather than applying the law impartially, the system risks granting different treatment based on identity. That strikes at the very foundation of justice, fairness, and equality under the law. If the law does not apply equally, the question becomes, what remains of justice at all? This concern is not confined to Britain. Similar debates are unfolding in the United States, where policies increasingly place identity ahead of the individual. Australia, too, is moving in the same direction. With new measures on hate speech and identity-based policy, what we are witnessing, then, is not an isolated trend, but a global shift away from liberal traditions that prioritize the individual, and toward frameworks that privilege group identity. The consequences could be profound, threatening not only individual rights, but the cohesion of the diverse societies these policies claim to protect.
Mr. Speaker, we've been preparing for all eventualities ahead of the confirmation of US tariffs later today. Let me be clear with the House. A trade war is in nobody's interests, and the country deserves, and we will take, a calm, pragmatic approach. That's why constructive talks are progressing to agree a wider economic prosperity deal with the US. That's why we're working with all industries and sectors likely to be impacted. Our decisions will always be guided by our national interest, and that's why we have prepared for all eventualities, and we will rule nothing out.